Finance Committee will come to order. Let's see how we're doing with the ringer. I think we have a little bit of a backdraft. How's that? A little better?
Not much.
All right. Our wizards, our wonderful IT wizards, can you try once more? I'm obviously the culprit because I see myself on the screen. Otherwise, we'll just keep going. How's that? A little better? Okay, the Finance Committee meets this, no, that's brief IT pause. You think we're going to get a recess?
I wasn't aware it was at risk, is it?
One more try. Sounds a little better. Okay. The Finance Committee meets this morning to discuss an important set of nominations that span 3 federal agencies and at least 2 continents. Maria Pagan is President Biden's nominee to serve as a deputy U.S. Trade Representative and our envoy to the WTO in Geneva. Ms. Pagan brings to her nomination nearly 3 decades of experience in international trade law. She currently serves as USTR's Deputy General Counsel, which puts her right at the heart of just about every effort to ensure that our trade laws are protecting American workers and businesses and giving them a shot to get ahead. She has valuable experience litigating disputes before the WTO, which makes her the right choice for this job. Chris Wilson is President Biden's nominee to serve as USTR's Chief Innovation and Intellectual Property Negotiator. It's the first time a nominee for this role has come before the Finance Committee since the committee created the position in the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015, and it was long overdue. We all take as a bedrock principle that we want to get trade done right, and getting trade done right in the modern economy means going to bat for manufacturers, farmers, and ranchers, and fighting for the high-wage, high-skilled jobs and businesses of the modern economy. It also means ensuring that our policies balance out the interests of IP owners, innovators, technology users, and the public at large. Mr. Wilson brings to his nomination 20 years of experience, a USTR during which he's represented American workers and businesses in negotiations across the globe. All that experience makes him an ideal choice to be the first ever Chief Innovation and IP negotiator. Joshua Frost is President Biden's nominee to serve as Assistant Treasury Secretary for Financial Markets. It's a challenging job. It deals with a variety of subjects that include debt management, the housing market, and the health of our financial system. Mr. Frost has more than 20 years of experience in a variety of roles at the Federal Reserve, including more than 12 years at the Open Markets Desk. He's overseen programs aiming at preventing another financial crisis and responding to the COVID-19 crash. He is a natural fit for the position because it's all about protecting the integrity and the stability of our financial system. Dr. Brent Nyman is President Biden's nominee to serve as a Deputy Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Finance and Development. This job deals with the most tangled, complicated policy questions having to do with the global economy. One of the big challenges Dr. Nyman will be working on, if and when he's confirmed, is how to solve the interruptions of global supply chains that are continuing to pop up as the pandemic continues to infect people around the world. And I know Dr. Nyman has considerable experience on these issues, and we look forward to his testimony. He'll also work on the issue of currency manipulation, which is a subject this committee takes very seriously. Mr. Nyman will have a leading role in the effort to make sure that multinational corporations can no longer hide their profits in a set of shadowy tax shelters around the globe instead of paying a fair share. Dr. Nyman is currently the Edward Eagle Brown Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and he does, as I indicated, have decades of research and expertise on international macroeconomics, finance, and trade. My view is he is an excellent choice for a difficult job. And finally, Sam Begginstows is President Biden's nominee to serve as General Counsel of the Department of Health and Human Services. He has worn a lot of hats in public service. Currently, he serves as General Counsel of the Office of Management and Budget from 2009 to 2011. He was Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, and there he argued cases before the Supreme Court dealing with protections for pregnant workers and Americans with disabilities. He's an expert in civil rights law. He's currently on leave from his position as the Frank Millard Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. At Health and Human Services, he'll work closely with Secretary Becerra and his team and provide legal advice on all of the department's efforts to make health care more affordable, strengthen Medicaid, uphold the Medicare guarantee, and ensure that vulnerable people in our country are protected and cared for. Congratulations to all 5 nominees. We've heard a lot of comments from those who have followed these issues over the years about each of you, and we look forward to your testimony. And after Senator Crapo makes his opening remarks, I'll have a few routine questions that we ask of all nominees, and then we'll have, I know, a very positive discussion. Let me recognize my friend, Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as you've indicated today, we will hear from a panel of nominees who will influence and implement a broad range of the administration's priorities. Dr. Nyman, the United States is the best place in the world to do business. Not surprisingly, that has drawn foreign investment, which has benefited our citizens immensely. And I look forward to hearing your views on how the United States can remain a prized destination for foreign investment. I fear that uncontrolled spending, burdensome regulations, and potential tax increases, including on the middle class, will make America less competitive and less attractive for foreign investment. The administration's international tax negotiations are concerning, given a lack of detailed consultation with Congress as a whole. I'm also concerned about how some of our overseas rivals are manipulating international organizations the U.S. helped found, like the World Bank. The U.S. and other countries established these institutions to promote global prosperity, not to further parochial interests. Mr. Frost, I look forward to hearing about your thoughts on the administration's fiscal policy, the debt ceiling, and proposed financial market reforms, including the United States Treasury securities market and the replacement of LIBOR. The debt limit provides an important check on both the President's and Congress's policies. And if fiscal decisions that will influence debt accumulation moving forward are willfully made by one party alone, then the accompanying obligation to change the debt limit to accommodate those fiscal choices must also be made by the party making unilateral choices. Tools and time are available to unilaterally accomplish such a change in the debt limit. Along the way, Mr. Frost, I look forward to your commitment to ensure that Treasury keeps members of this committee fully and timely informed on the nation's debt, cash balances, and debt management. Turning to LIBOR, while recent administrations, the Federal Reserve, and market participants have worked successfully to establish the secured overnight financing rate as an alternative reference rate, nearly $2 trillion in LIBOR-linked exposures are expected to remain outstanding after the termination of LIBOR in June 2023. It's important to understand how the administration plans to address this looming challenge. Ms. Pagan, the World Trade Organization is critical to our trading interests, but is in need of reform. I look forward to hearing your views on how to make the institution more effective. Mr. Wilson, if confirmed, you will be the first Deputy U.S. Trade Representative for Innovation and Intellectual Property. Strong intellectual property protections are critical to America's economic prosperity, and this is especially true today. Mr. Wilson, I want to know your priorities for the position and how we can combat unfair practices by our global competitors, like theft and forced technology transfers, and how we can protect intellectual property and private intellectual property rights. Additionally, the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic has been lessened thanks to innovations born out of the partnership between the American government and American industry. It is critical that we not undermine the American people's ability to respond to future challenges with intelligence and agility. Mr. Begginstows, as the nominee for General Counsel at HHS, you will have a key role in opining on the legality of new regulations. I'm interested in your perspective on providing legal opinions to Congress so that we can understand and discuss policymaking effectively with the administration. Already, this administration has shown a disturbing tendency to push through its policy preferences despite clear indications of the intent of Congress. Finally, I again emphasize the importance of responsiveness to this committee. While there have been noteworthy exceptions, several nominees before this committee have provided late, incomplete, and evasive responses to questions from the members of this panel. This makes it harder for the Finance Committee and its members to work constructively with the administration. I strongly urge the nominees here today to commit to timely and thorough communication with this committee. I congratulate the nominees here before us today, and I look forward to our discussion with you today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. What we'll do now is we'll have the opening statements, then we have some obligatory questions that we have to ask, but let's just proceed. We'll make your complete statements a part of the record in their entirety, and let's start with Ms. Pagan.
Thank you. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, members of the committee, good morning. It is an honor to be here today as nominee for Deputy U.S. Trade Representative in Geneva. I'm grateful to President Biden for this nomination and to Ambassador Tai for her support. I'm also grateful to my family, my parents, my two brothers and their wives, and my son for their support, love, and inspiration. My parents are doctors and dedicated their professional lives to advancing public health in Puerto Rico. I learned from them the value of public service and of taking pride in what you do. They couldn't be here with me, but I'm sure they're watching. My son couldn't be here either, as he's a first-year law student on the West Coast, but his support is enormously important to me. I come here before you today having spent nearly 30 years as a civil servant, first at the Department of Commerce and for the last 18 years at USTR, representing our country in trade negotiations and litigation. I want to underscore Ambassador Tai's recent speech, where she reaffirmed the United States' commitment to the WTO. However, there is a growing recognition that after 25 years, the institution needs to be reformed in order to be effective and relevant for the next 25 years. If confirmed, it would be an honor to represent the United States in Geneva at this critical juncture. Ambassador Tai emphasized the Biden-Harris administration's belief that trade and the WTO can be a force for good, and she laid out her vision to help the organization reorient its mission to better serve and advance the interests of regular people. Taking steps to address the COVID-19 pandemic would be a good start. It also means finding a way to incorporate the interests and priorities of workers into the WTO's work. Ambassador Tai also spoke about the need for dispute settlement reform to help empower members to secure actual resolutions and provide confidence that the system is fair. These challenges are central to the WTO's ability to operate as it was envisioned at its founding. I know this won't be easy. As Deputy General Counsel at USTR, my job is to get things done, and I will bring that can-do approach and attitude to Geneva. We need to be creative, not just focus on the areas where we disagree, but find the areas where we can agree. We need to listen to each other and not just talk at one another. And we need to listen to voices outside of Geneva and Washington, D.C. in order to broaden our perspectives. It includes working with this committee and members of Congress. Actions or inaction at the WTO directly affects communities, workers, farmers, and small businesses in your states. If confirmed, I commit to maintain open lines of communication with all of you and represent the interests of your constituents in Geneva. As a longtime member of the USTR family, I know I will be able to count on a fantastic career staff, known for its excellence, hard work, and creativity. It is reassuring to know they will be there to support me. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Witness will be Dr. Nyman. Excuse us, we're juggling a lot with Build Back Better and the BIF, and I apologize.
Fantastic. Thank you, Senator. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and distinguished members of this committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear here before you today as nominee to be Deputy Undersecretary for International Finance and Development at the Treasury. I'm also deeply grateful to President Biden and to Secretary Yellen for placing their confidence in me. My amazing wife, Yael, is here, and we are both so proud of our wonderful kids, our 11-year-old daughter, Tal, and our 8-year-old son, Lev. My parents, Bill and Gail, have always been encouraging and are watching from home right now. I am very appreciative of my entire family's support. My grandparents are also in my thoughts. My grandmother, Margot, who fled from Germany in 1939 to Decatur, Illinois, always encouraged an awareness of world affairs and an understanding of other people, places, and cultures. My grandpa, Julie, who ran a small manufacturer, hired me for various summer jobs and taught me about entrepreneurship and small business. I'm grateful for what they shared with me and imagine that all 4 of my grandparents would be very proud today. My interest in international economics started early in high school when I gave a speech about the ECU, the euro's predecessor, for the final project of my sophomore year speech class. My teacher criticized the topic as hopelessly dry, but I stuck with it. And since then, I've worked as the staff economist at the Council of Economic Advisors, written a doctoral dissertation at Harvard, consulted to the IMF, and presented to central banks all around the world. For the past 13 years, I've taught a course at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business called International Financial Policy. I hope I've been able to prove my high school teacher wrong and instill some excitement about international macroeconomics into the next generation of leaders. My research has uniquely prepared me to serve in this position at this time. I've published papers exploring the changing international role of the U.S. dollar and analyzing financial exposures of U.S. investors to emerging market borrowers. My work has evaluated the impact of exchange rate movements on productivity during a sudden stop crisis and measured the price responses of U.S. importers and exporters to trade policies. I've developed models of how economic activity transmits across borders and used them to understand the formation and resolution of external imbalances. The pandemic has underscored how interconnected the world economy is. Continuing hardship in foreign countries spurs foreign families to leave, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Disruptions in the global supply chain keep our workers waiting for equipment and our consumers waiting for goods that both need. Slow growth abroad restricts markets for American businesses, large and small. Helping to alleviate suffering and restore financial and physical health to the rest of the world is worthy in its own right, but also benefits the U.S. economy and our national security. Thank you again for the privilege of appearing here today and for your consideration of my nomination. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Next, we'll have Mr. Frost.
Thank you. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm honored to be President Biden's nominee for Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Financial Markets, and I'm grateful to Secretary Yellen for her confidence in me. Before proceeding, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge my family, without whom I would not be sitting here today. My wife, Emily, my daughter, Lily, and my brother, Andy. I would also like to thank my parents, Robert and Nikki, who instilled in me the importance of public service via the example that they set as dedicated public school teachers. It was this early example of contributing to the greater good that led me to begin my career at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I've spent over 23 years at the New York Fed in a number of roles, and in each of those jobs, I saw firsthand the dedication of this committed group of public servants who selflessly helped me to develop my understanding of how different corners of financial markets operate and how the financial system can better serve the American people. If confirmed, I would welcome the opportunity to continue to serve our nation by supporting the President's and Secretary Yellen's priorities in leading the Office of Financial Markets. Among other responsibilities, this office helps formulate policy on debt management at the federal, state, and local levels, serves to assess the capital markets implications of various policy choices, and serves as the Treasury's eyes and ears in financial markets. This set of responsibilities aligns well with my interests and experience, and having spent my entire career focused on these issues, I look forward to taking a data-driven, taxpayer-centric approach to policymaking. Finally, I would note that managing the nation's debt is an awesome responsibility, and if confirmed, I would be sure to ground any debt management decisions in an assessment of what provides for the lowest cost of funding over time for the taxpayer. I believe that it's also critical to have a resilient and well-functioning Treasury market, and would look forward to working with other agencies to continue to ensure that the Treasury market is structured so that it remains the deepest, most liquid market in the world. Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee, thank you for considering my nomination. If confirmed, I look forward to working closely with you and your staff and appreciate the important oversight role of this committee. I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frost. Mr. Begginstows.
Thank you, Chairman Wyden, Ranking Member Crapo, and members of the committee. I very much appreciate your considering my nomination to be General Counsel at the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm humbled and honored by President Biden's decision to nominate me, and I'm excited, if confirmed, to serve under the leadership of Secretary Javier Becerra. I'd like to begin by thanking my family for their love and support. Here with me today is my wife, Margot Schlanger, who is a terrific and accomplished attorney in her own right. Watching me remotely are my children, Harry and Layla, who are twins in their senior year of college, and my mother, Nada Tushnet, who is nominally retired but works tirelessly to improve her community every day. I'd also like to thank my supervisors in my former government and current government positions, Governor Deval Patrick, former Secretary of Labor Tom Perez, and Acting Director of OMB Shalonda Young. And I'd like to thank the two great and now departed jurists for whom I clerked, Judge Stephen Reinhart and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, whose memories are a blessing for me. In the more than 28 years since I graduated law school, my work has sought to advance the paired principles that should always inform the application of the law. No person, no matter how high their position, should be above the law's constraints, nor should anyone be beneath its protections. Perhaps no case illustrates those principles better than that of George Lane. George had paraplegia and was a bit down on his luck, and when he was accused of a minor criminal violation, his hearing was held on the second floor of a courthouse with no elevator. And when he couldn't make it into the courtroom because his disability kept him from climbing stairs, he was arrested for failure to appear in court. I worked with George to take his case to the Supreme Court, and with the very welcome help of the President George W. Bush administration Solicitor General, we prevailed. George's case shows that at its best, the law must be open and responsive to even the humblest members of the community. I'm very proud to have achieved this result and to have worked with congressional and administration allies across partisan divides to build support for George's case. Should I be fortunate enough to be confirmed, I will approach the General Counsel role in the same spirit. I will work to ensure that the actions of the department conform to the substantive and procedural requirements that Congress has established, as well as the fundamental principles and protections of the Constitution. And I will work to ensure that the department advances its critical mission of enhancing the health and well-being of all Americans. During the Obama-Biden administration, I was the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice. In addition to supervising 200 attorneys across 3 sections of the Civil Rights Division, I led the department's enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Much of my disability rights work has required me to engage with state Medicaid programs to defend the rights of people with disabilities to receive services in their own homes and communities. I've worked with governors, sheriffs, and other state and local officials across party lines who are committed to providing quality services to individuals with disabilities. Through this work, I learned a lot about the particular needs of different states and regions, including how important tools such as telehealth can be in serving rural and other communities without access to specialized providers. And that, of course, is a lesson that the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored for all of us yet again. More than a year into that pandemic, the laws that HHS administers are essential to the department's mission and to the health and well-being of Americans. Should I be confirmed, I will seek to uphold the law with a commitment to equity, transparency, and accountability. Thank you again for considering my nomination, and I look forward to your questions.
I would just note, Mr. Begginstows, that you said your children were watching remotely. I will tell you, my children have discussed watching some of our hearings remotely, my older children, and they just said, seems like a little boring. But you all have been very interesting. All right, Mr. Wilson.
Chairman Wyden, Senator Crapo, members of the committee, good morning. In 1982, as a college junior, I spent a semester interning for my distinguished home state senator, Bob Dole. At the time, Senator Dole was serving as chairman of this committee. To now find myself sitting at this table in this room is an honor that is made maybe a little bit more special by virtue of that personal history. I'm honored that President Biden nominated me to serve as the first ever Chief Innovation and Intellectual Property Negotiator at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and I'm grateful to you, Senators, for your consideration. I want to acknowledge the many friends and colleagues who have enriched my career at USTR over the past 2 decades. I've had great teachers and excellent examples among both my fellow civil servants and the agency's political leaders over the years. I'm glad that my husband, Mark Hegedus, is here this morning, and I'm grateful for his love and support. I'm also thinking of my mom and my dad, who passed away earlier this year. If confirmed for this position, I would be the first person to hold the title. To do a job for the first time is both exciting and a little daunting. Fortunately, Congress has provided a very clear expectation of what the position is about, namely, to be a, quote, vigorous advocate on behalf of United States innovation and intellectual property interests, end quote. If I'm confirmed, those words will be prominently displayed on my desk at USTR. I understand how protecting U.S. innovation through intellectual property rights is key to our nation's economic success. This principle has been woven through every position I've held during my years at USTR. In addition to serving directly in USTR's IP office from 2006 to 2008, I've worked on important IP issues in my engagements with trading partners in Central America, Europe and the Middle East, South and Central Asia, and in the context of the World Trade Organization. This work has reinforced my belief that trade policy must protect American innovation and creative endeavors, and that the rules governing that protection should be effectively enforced. I look forward to your input today and going forward on how best to advance those objectives. Senators, one of my early mentors at USTR taught me that in any negotiation, as well as in the process of policy development, listening is as important as talking. I intend to apply that lesson every day that I'm in this position. My experience has taught me that perhaps more than in many other areas of trade policy, IP is the subject of strongly held and often widely divergent views among a broad spectrum of stakeholders. If confirmed, my door will be open to all, and I will listen carefully. I assure you that this committee and its staff would be prominent among those from whom I expect to be guided. Ambassador Tai has laid out a worker-centered trade policy that ensures, as President Biden often says, that our economy grows from the bottom up and the middle out. If confirmed, I will always be thinking about how we can defend U.S. innovation and intellectual property in order to help workers and generate broad-based, durable prosperity. Finally, Senators, it will be important to me to ensure that the relationship between this new chief negotiator function and the dedicated career professionals in USTR's IP office is placed on a sound, sustainable, and respectful footing. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you this morning. I look forward to your questions and your advice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wilson. And it's, excuse me, it's obviously you're someone who takes family very seriously, and it's sad to hear about the loss of both your parents so soon and recent. We now have some obligatory questions we have to ask of all of you. First, is there anything that you're aware of in your background that might present a conflict of interest with the duties of the office to which you've been nominated? We'll start with you, Ms. Pagan.
No.
No.
No. No.
No.
Do you know of any reason, personal or otherwise, that would in any way prevent you from fully and honorably discharging the responsibilities of the office to which you've been nominated, Ms. Pagan?
No.
No.
No. No.
No.
Third, do you agree without reservation to respond to any reasonable summons to appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of the Congress if you're confirmed?
Yes.
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 Finally, do you commit to provide a prompt response in writing to any questions addressed to you by any senator or the committee?
Yes.
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 Very good. We'll begin now. I'll have some questions. Senator Crapo will have some questions. Ms. Pagan, let me start with you. I have been following the WTO fishing subsidies negotiations for quite some time. And I have to tell you, from the perspective of Oregon fishing families, they are getting ripped off by Chinese fishing fleets. These families are competing regularly with slave labor, and they're subsidizing long-distance Chinese fishing fleets. It is absolutely critical for the health of the oceans and the survival of the family-owned businesses that we crack down on this behavior with strong, enforceable rules. What would be your message this morning, Ms. Pagan, to those fishing families in Oregon that are hurting, that believe they're just getting exploited by unfair rules? What would be your message to them about your first action in Geneva to close out these negotiations in a way that would allow our fishing families to get a fair shake and have the full fruits of competition?
Well, thank you for that question. My answer is we do want to have an agreement, but we want an agreement that is effective in cracking down on harmful fish subsidies so we can save the fish and save the fishers that depend on having those resources. So while we want an agreement that is high standard and meaningful. Our challenge is to make sure that we achieve those rules, but that we don't also have them riddled with loopholes. The United States has been playing a leadership role in these negotiations for a long time, and if confirmed, I will continue to play that role, and hopefully we can get to an agreement that changes the status quo and doesn't just, continue the situation the way it is. And if confirmed, I look forward to working with you on this.
I appreciate that. I'm going to hold the record open to give you a chance to give a more complete answer. I'm not sure that you are aware that'd be my first question. This is something I feel very strongly about, and our trading opponents on these issues have been playing stall ball on fairness in fishing for too long, and I'm just committed to getting it changed, and the ambassador, to her credit, has been candid with me. So we'll hold the record open for, say, 72 hours for a more complete answer on that, okay?
Thank you.
Good. Mr. Begginstows, let's talk about mental health. Mental health is one of the aspects of the pandemic that saw the most dramatic changes. The number of claims are now in the stratosphere, and we see folks who suffered new mental health challenges through isolation. Families were stressed. There were challenges with distance learning. Senator Crapo and I are working in a bipartisan way to try to respond to this. But I want to ask you specifically, as a lawyer. My brother was a schizophrenic, and every night the Wydens went to bed at night realizing he might be on the street and he could hurt himself or somebody else. So the day when we got the bipartisan parity law in place, I said, this means new hope for Jeff Wyden and millions of others. But I'm convinced that the legal right to parity for access to mental health services, parity between mental health and physical health, is honored as much in the breach as it is in the observance. And I would like to hear, what specifically are you going to do to get tough with these insurance companies that, in my view, aren't really complying with that tough law for parity between mental health and physical health?
Thank you, Senator Wyden, for that question. It is, as you know, an area I've worked in quite a lot in the past, and I very much appreciate your leadership on mental health issues. Mental health parity is, as you say, Senator, something that is in the law, but we have great concerns about ensuring that the law is actually complied with. One of the issues, of course, is the fragmentation of the enforcement of mental health parity across different agencies of the federal government, not just HHS, but also labor, also Treasury, and not just the federal government, but also the states because of the way we structure our regulation of insurance in the United States. I can commit, if confirmed, to doing whatever I can to ensure that the laws are fully enforced and complied with, and working with you and this committee if there are additional tools that are necessary.
Yep, this is another area where I'm going to want to see more specifics. I mean, the question of our economics and our health policy are both important to me. So within the next 72 hours, I would like to see more specifics. This is so outrageous. You may have heard at the Oregon Health Sciences Center, they couldn't get their bills paid for mental health services. And then we said we were going to open an investigation. There was an article in the newspaper, and suddenly all the bills were paid. That's not a parity policy for America. So I would like to have within 72 hours what, again, in more detail, you all are going to actually do to make sure that we're able to carry out a real parity policy, not just one that's in name only. Absolutely. One last question, if I could, very quickly for Chris Wilson. On this issue of balancing innovation and protecting lives, you know, our hearts say we need to get life-saving technology out as fast as possible, while our heads caution the need to protect important innovations. How do you strike the balance?
Chairman Wyden, I think you've put your finger on what is and has been for 20 years or more the great challenge of intellectual property trade policy. There is this tension between the need to reward innovation through intellectual property and the equally important objective of being able to ensure access to the products of that innovation. It's a struggle. It has been a struggle for as long as I've worked on these issues at USTR. I expect it to continue to be a struggle. We have to keep to try to get the balance right. And if confirmed, I'd work very closely with you and others on the committee to make sure that we're getting as close to that balance line as we can.
Thank you. Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I go to questions, I wanted to just note that Senator Wyden and I work together on a lot of issues on a bipartisan basis, and we've got a lot of big successes. He mentioned the mental health issue in his questioning, but you didn't even realize this because we haven't talked about it, Senator Wyden. But before, but you just raised in your first question to Ms. Pagan another important issue that I think we can work on together.
Yes.
And that is the Chinese fishing fleets. Idaho isn't a coastal state, but we are as concerned about this as is Oregon and are the rest of Americans. And frankly, the violation in Washington.
You bet.
But you know, this goes beyond just the United States. The Chinese fishing fleets are aggressively damaging fisheries around the globe and creating not only damage economically, but they are also creating damage to some of the great treasures in our oceans. And I think it's really important for us to focus on that. So, Ms. Pagan, this is not an issue that I realized would be in my questions, but I appreciated your questions on that, Senator White. Let me go to Mr. Frost. Mr. Frost, this summer the Congressional Budget Office estimated that under baseline spending projections, by 2031, the national debt held by the public would grow to $35.8 trillion, or 106.4% of GDP. Net interest would grow to $910 billion, more than 2.6 times what it was in 2020, and would account for 11.6% of federal outlays. Relatively minor increases of interest rates will force our interest obligations even higher, choking off fiscal space necessary for domestic programs that help American families. How much debt can the United States incur before that affects the federal government's ability to borrow affordably while still providing for essential services in our nation's security?
Thank you, Ranking Member Crapo. So you're raising an important issue. So the level of debt is critically important. I would note the role to which I've been nominated. My principal responsibility would be to manage the nation's debt in a prudent fashion, overseeing the team that keeps the government running, keeps the government funded. Much of the recent run-up in the debt and the deficit has been the result of helping the nation weather the shock posed from the recent pandemic, and that would flag that decisions on the level of debt are ultimately those left to Congress, that the level of spending and the level of taxation, ultimately, that it's that leftover that needs to be funded, and that's what my role would be, to ensure that the amount that needs to get funded is funded in the most efficient manner. I could talk just for a moment about what financial markets are telling us about the issue you've raised. Debt service costs, as you flagged, are historically low levels now. If I look at what the yield curve is telling us, it's at historically low levels, and it's quite flat, which would tell me that financial markets aren't immediately focused on the issue that you're raising. It's not that it's not a critically important issue, but it's not showing through in asset prices today. Finally, I would note that the administration's plans are intended to bring down the level of debt to GDP in the longer run, while still in response to the pandemic, there would likely be a modest increase in the medium term.
Well, let me follow up on that. How would your answer to the question be affected by literally trillions of dollars of new and permanent spending? Or do you believe the rhetoric that the reckless fiscal plans being considered for reconciliation have zero cost? Do you accept that there is zero cost to the spending proposals before Congress right now?
So, Senator, I don't think anything has zero cost. I think it's about managing risks and trade-offs. And so I still think we're in a place where we're thinking about how best to respond to the pandemic, and from the additional plans, how best to position the economy for growth going forward. As I mentioned, I think the projections are that this will ultimately result in a lower debt burden in the future if we take care of and have greater take care of these issues today and have a stronger potential for growth in the future.
Well, I appreciate your acknowledgement about the issue of zero cost. Mr. Nyman, to you, this year the administration is contemplating massive increases in taxes and spending through reconciliation. While the size and indeed the contents of this fiscal agenda are still unclear, I'm concerned about the possibility that they will exacerbate inflation trends, which even former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers has described as disturbing. What risks do higher domestic taxes and substantial inflation pose to the reputation of the United States as a good destination for foreign investment?
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member Crapo. When thinking about the destination of the United States for investment, the same things presumably that make it a better destination for foreign investment make it a better place to do domestic investment. And it's, of course, very important that we take steps to make it as productive as possible to invest capital here, regardless of who's doing the investment. And, of course, taxes are one element of the calculation. On the other side, balancing out the effect of taxes, of course, are things like the quality of our infrastructure, the investments that we make in our workforce. Are we the best place to build businesses? Are we the best place to hire people? And so, there's obviously a trade-off. As you raise taxes, the question is, are you raising them in a way that then contributes to the productivity of the workforce, that makes the country's infrastructure better, that invites investment, whether it's domestic sourced or foreign sourced? And so thinking about that balance is I think, very important and hopefully what we're going to get right.
Well, thank you. And just one more real quick question, and again for you, Mr. Frost. I commend the efforts by recent administrations, the Federal Reserve, and the market participants to plan for the elimination of LIBOR. Despite these best efforts, there remains $2 trillion of LIBOR-linked exposures that market observers believe will remain outstanding after June 2023. Treasury Secretary Yellen and Fed Chair Powell have stated their belief that a federal legislative solution is necessary to transition those exposures from LIBOR to SOFR. How do you believe the administration should address this challenge, and is legislation the answer? And if that is what you believe, do you think that something like the S-297B law passed by New York this year is a model we should look at?
Thank you, Ranking Member. You're raising another critically important issue to me. I've spent a good deal of my career focused on the transition from LIBOR. One conclusion I've come to, it's costly. And this is something you want to do once and you want to do it right. And we wouldn't want to see a move to a rate that had the same underlying flaws and vulnerabilities that LIBOR had. While wouldn't want to comment on specific legislation. I do think that a legislative fix is likely going to be needed here for these so-called tough legacy contracts where there's no clear fallback or otherwise an unworkable fallback in language.
From you on this as we move forward.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you. Congratulations to all the nominees. Ms. Pagan, once I heard then Commerce Secretary Ron Brown said he was Secretary of all of Commerce, but if he was getting a call from a member of Congress, he guaranteed it was about fish. And it just shows you here how important fisheries are to all our states, to the United States, and now to the globe. Why? Because we see warmer climates affecting fisheries. We see the Arctic being opened and probably claims to fisheries. We have, our history about fishing in international waters and illegal fishing. So, illegal fishing in our waters and setting up those boundaries. So I hope that you will be very serious about keeping your foot on these negotiations as it relates, well, I should say, and the world is looking, in a growing world, looking for more protein sources, and people are looking at fisheries. So we have good fisheries management in the United States. I would hope that that would be something in the debate, that sustainable fisheries should be part of the requirements in trying to create a more market. And I believe we should be in the business of exporting what those sustainable fishery practices look like, because we are, at least in parts of our country, very good at it and being very successful. So I may submit something to the record for you. Mr. Frost, you are going to be in the office overseeing the capital markets, and one of the issues is housing policy. And I'm very interested. Our committee here has done great work on the low-income housing tax credit, but we still have a tremendous amount of way to go. We have 7 million units that we need to be built, and over 10 million people who live in rent-burdened conditions. 50% of their income is spent on rent. We have just not kept pace with supply. So I want to make sure that the administration, now as we're talking about proposals here, they're doing a lot on the putting vouchers into people's hands. I appreciate. Grants or programs that help individuals, but even the home grant program that the administration is pushing, 53% of those get built with the affordable housing tax credit. It's a partnership between the home grant program and LIHTC. So if you don't increase LIHTC, you're not going to be increasing the supply of affordable housing. So I just want to hear from you that you believe that we need a robust response here, and that you're going to work within the administration to try to get that.
Absolutely, Senator. The supply of affordable housing is a key issue now, and as you flagged, LIHTC is a principal venue by which affordable housing supply is created. There's no magic bullet solution here. I wish there was. I wish there was a simple resolution. But as you said, things that focus on increasing the supply of affordable housing, things that focus targeted programs that help with down payment support, which help folks build wealth more quickly, are all critical to the success.
But if we just did those and we didn't do the supply side, that would be a problem, correct?
Completely agree. There's
okay.
a massive supply.
So that's the point I'm trying to get out, particularly today, that this is the debate in front of us, that you can spend a lot of money on those issues, but if you're not increasing supply, then you're not going to have a place for these individuals to go. And so we got to make sure that we're putting a solid number. We proposed in a bipartisan fashion with our colleagues here, Senator Young, Senator Portman, $29 billion in the affordable housing tax credit. Well, a proposal to increase it by 50%. So there is good bipartisan support, and the reason is people know how unique the program is, that you can do lots of different things within your own states and jurisdictions. I mean, you can build something just for veterans. You can build something just, for a workforce. You can do all sorts of things. So the flexibility of it is pretty supported. And frankly, I just hope we do put this money there. Right now it's needed. So Mr. Wilson, I just want you and Ms. Pagan, on the innovation side, we've worked hard to give USTR the resources of more lawyers so we can dispute our claims internationally, and obviously build capacity internationally for those countries that don't have quite the same capacity we do to judge these cases. But on this issue of technology, don't we need to be first of all, getting the world community behind us, on these telecommunications issues, that the only way you're going to have acceptable frameworks is if you have a rule of law. If you basically have a court system and a government that doesn't own the technology or has a backdoor to it. Don't we need to speak loudly on this point, Mr. Wilson?
Thanks, Senator Cantwell. I agree completely with you. I think that capacity building and emphasis on respect for the rule of law has got to be a critical part of our promotion of innovation through trade policy generally and specifically in the areas of emerging technology, and look forward to working with you on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. Next is Senator Grassley.
My first question would be to Mr. Begginstows in regard to the 340B program. Listen to while I lead into the question. Many Iowa hospitals and pharmacists have talked to me about the 340B program, how these drug companies are harming access to it. The 340B drug program is an important program to keep drug costs low and maintain access for patients. Iowa pharmacists and hospitals have communicated to me the administrative burdens that the drug companies have placed on the 340B program. Last year, I pressed the Trump administration to do something. They put out some advisories that were withdrawn. The administration has written to at least 6 companies about what they have to do, and you haven't heard back from the companies. The IG is investigating this. While the Biden administration has taken a different approach from the Trump administration, I want you to know that I appreciate the efforts of the Biden administration. However, timely resolution is needed, or this will have financial impact on hospitals and pharmacies and could even hurt patient access. So I want more transparency in the 340B program. The status quo is not sustainable. So if confirmed, what additional steps could HHS take to protect the program? I hope that HHS has all the tools they need, and if not, do you have recommendations for Congress to act?
Thank you, Senator Grassley, for that question. The 340B program is an incredibly important safety net program to ensure that folks in rural areas and other underserved areas have access to affordable prescription drugs. It matters a lot to me personally. My father actually is from a very small town in rural Iowa. My late father, who died about 10 years ago, is from a small town called Holstein in northwest Iowa, where I'm sure you've been. So I take this matter very seriously. Personally, I can tell you in this administration, the drug companies that have not been complying with 340B requirements to work with contract pharmacies, as you said, Senator, have been referred for enforcement. One of the important jobs of the General Counsel, should I be confirmed for this position, will be to ensure that those enforcement actions proceed as effectively as they can be. There's also quite a lot of other litigation involving 340B, which the General Counsel will be required to, and should I be confirmed, I'll be required to address. I think it's exceptionally important that this administration confirm its commitment to the 340B program. And Senator, if there are additional tools that are necessary, I can commit to working with you on what those tools might be.
I assume you grew up in Ida Grove or Holstein.
Well, so I was born in St. Louis, Missouri, actually, so the big city by comparison.
Okay. Now, Mr. Frost, some economists and politicians have contended that due to the historically low interest rates, we shouldn't worry about financing new spending. Some even claim that it would be foolish not to spend more money and not to worry about it. However, with our national debt now exceeding the entire size of our economy, even small increases in interest rates would mean trillions of dollars more spent to service that debt. Given the sensitivity of our debt to future interest rate increases, do you agree it would be fiscally foolish to run up our our national debt, betting on a wing and prayer that interest rates would remain historically low?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So in the role that I've been nominated for, my principal responsibilities will be to ensure that for any given level of debt, that debt is funded in the most efficient manner possible. If I look at what signal we're getting here from financial markets about what concern is out there about the level of debt and the prospective future level of debt, there's not a lot coming through at this point. The yield curve, or in other words, the level of interest rates to borrow it for a shorter term or for a longer term, are both quite low. The yield curve is also quite flat, suggesting that the markets are not terribly concerned by an increase in interest rates in the intermediate to longer term. I believe that if the plans that are being proposed are adopted, I think the administration's proposals would likely result in a modest uptick in the level of debt to GDP over the medium term, but bring it down in the longer run.
I thank my colleague. Next is Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Pagan, is human trafficking a violation of the USMCA?
Senator Menendez, thank you for that question. I'm going to have to think about that. I honestly wasn't prepared for that question.
Okay, well, from my perspective, it is. And the question, what I'd like you, as you're reviewing that, is I would like to get your commitment that if human trafficking in general is a violation of the USMCA, which I believe it is, then I would like your commitment to look at what is happening in Mexico with Cuban doctors who are being trafficked. They are sent there by the Cuban regime. Their passports are taken away. The payment for their services is sent to the Cuban regime. They get a subsistence wage. That's trafficking. And so I'd like a commitment from you that you will review it and get back to me when, upon your confirmation.
You have my commitment that we will look at the issue. Thank you. And if there's any more information that we can get from you or your staff,
we
please
got tons, so I'm happy to give it all to the department. Great. And I know that Ambassador Tai is going to be with the committee later today, so we'll raise it with her as well. Mr. Nyman, if confirmed, you'll be responsible for U.S. actions at the international financial institutions. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which I chair, has considerable oversight over these institutions, so I want to explore one or two items with you in that regard. As part of our efforts to counter and compete with China globally, the Senate passed my legislation authorizing a 10th general capital increase for the Inter-American Development Bank as part of the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. During the pandemic, countries in the hemisphere suffered the greatest economic contraction of any region in the world. And add to that the enduring challenges of poverty and inequality, massive migration flows, the damages caused by natural disasters, and we are seeing a region facing widespread difficulties. And it matters to us not only about being a good neighbor, but when we see migration flows come to the United States in part, it is because of the uncertainty these countries are facing. Not to mention that China is all over the hemisphere in terms of its debt trap diplomacy. So if we are serious about addressing these challenges, we need the IDB to have robust resources, and a 10th general capital increase is part of that process. If confirmed, do you commit to working with me and other congressional stakeholders to ensure that the IDB has the resources to address challenges in our hemisphere and advance a 10th general capital increase for the bank?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And if I could start, thank you for your leadership and work on issues in that region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the focus of the IDB. That's a region that's also of personal importance to me. My wife, for example, was born in South America. It's also a region, as you noted, that's been particularly hard hit during these recent pandemic. Something that oftentimes isn't fully appreciated, and of course, it's a neighboring region.
I appreciate all that. Does that mean, yes, you're going to work with me to get to where we need to be on the capital increase?
Thank you, Senator. It does mean that, of course, it would be a very important area and set of issues for me, and if confirmed, I would absolutely fully engage with you and your staff on all those issues. I understand that Treasury, together with IDB management and stakeholders, are evaluating opportunities for development finance in the region, understanding the current portfolio and limitations of development finance.
Well, what I would hope is that you'd commit to working with Congress to put in place a policy framework for the IDB's 10th capital increases that addresses U.S. priorities, including democratic governance, climate issues, and the need to counter China's predatory economic practices in the region. Can I get you at least to that?
I absolutely will, if confirmed, commit to work with you on those issues.
Now, one other question in the 45 seconds I have. I have a real challenge with what is happening at the IMF and I should say the World Bank and the IMF with Kristalina Georgieva, who currently serves as the managing director of the IMF. She was involved in pressuring staff to make specific changes to China's 2018 score in the World Bank's annual Doing Business report in an effort to increase their ranking. That's incredibly disturbing. It damages the integrity and reputation of the World Bank and the IMF and confirms the growing trend of the international financial institutions bowing to Chinese pressure. Senator Risch, the ranking member, and I both wrote to the Biden administration calling for full transparency and accountability at the World Bank, the IMF, and with Ms. Georgieva. Can you tell me that you will work to provide that transparency?
Senator, if confirmed, I commit to support Treasury's efforts to get the IMF to renew their commitment to data transparency and other measures like whistleblower protections that would safeguard the integrity of the international financial institution.
She's lost my confidence, and I want to see how she actually can operate under these circumstances. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Menendez. I believe we have Senator Carper on the web, and then Senator Carper would be followed by Senator Cassidy, who's here. Senator Carper, are you out there in cyberspace?
Here. Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Can you hear me?
Good morning.
All right. Good. To our nominees, congratulations on your nomination. Thank you for appearing today, and for all your families across the world who are listening as well. I would like to start off with a question I could for Ms. Pagan, dealing with the WTO reform. Ms. Pagan, I've always felt it's if something imperfect, we ought to work to make it better. And there's been a great deal of conversation, really, on both sides of the aisle and across the globe about the need for reforms in the WTO. And we know that the WTO has an important role to play in combating unfair trade practices that persist in non-market economies like China. Unfortunately, the organization continues to face challenges with its dispute settlement system, including the lack of quorum on the appellate body that has weakened the WTO's enforcement. My question is this, Ms. Pagan. In your opinion, what strategy should our country take, the U.S. take, to reforming the WTO and addressing the inoperability of the WTO's appellate body? Please, go right ahead.
Thank you, Senator Carper. The good thing is that we all agree, I think there's consensus that the WTO and particularly the appellate body need to be reformed. I guess on the other hand, we all have different views of what reform means, in particularly with respect to the appellate body. What we want, and if confirmed, what I will work hard to do is to have conversations so that we can restore the appellate body and the dispute settlement system to what we thought we had agreed to. We never intended the appellate body to be a rulemaking body. We believe that rules have to be enforced, but it has to be the rules as they were negotiated and agreed by the members. So we need to, USTR has been having these conversations, and we will continue to have these conversations, and I suspect that we'll spend a lot of time having these conversations with our counterparts at the WTO to make sure that we can restore the appellate body and the system to the way that we envisioned it at the beginning. And I don't think it's going to be an easy conversation, but it's something that I look forward to doing while I'm there.
All right. Thanks, Ms. Pagan. My second question would be for Mr. Nyman, Mr. Wilson, and also for you, Ms. Pagan. And for each of you, we'll start off with Mr. Nyman. But I want to begin by, again, thank you for joining us. But and for your willingness to serve our country. These are important roles. We know that and appreciate it. But one of the biggest questions facing our country, I think it's facing our planet, is how to work collectively to address our shared problems. And you may have heard an old African American proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, travel together. And goals like tackling climate change, like tackling this pandemic, and expanding economic prosperity require global cooperation. Unfortunately, the previous administration all too often turned away from multilateral engagement and ultimately ceded U.S. leadership on the global stages in a number of instances. Here's my question, starting with Mr. Nyman. Should you be confirmed, you'll represent the U.S. before international organizations and within multilateral negotiations. How do you view your role within the broader effort to rebuild U.S. leadership on the global stage? Mr. Nyman, would you lead us off, please? And then Mr. Wilson, and then Ms. Pagan. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator, for your question. The role to which I've been nominated for, I view as playing a key role in Treasury's macroeconomic engagement with the rest of the world, whether bilaterally, country by country, or through multilateral institutions like the international financial institutions, the G7, the G20. And I'm very supportive of the President's goal of restoring America's global standing and leadership in these institutions. One good example, I think, that you mentioned in your question is our efforts, including, for example, through multilateral development banks, to encourage decarbonization efforts, since that's a good example of a problem that, of course, only really has a global solution. So that's an example of one way in which I would think about your question, and if confirmed, Senator, I'd happy to work with you and your staff and hear about other ideas you have on asserting U.S. leadership in these organizations.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Nyman. Mr. Wilson, please, same question.
Thank you, Senator Carper. I've been privileged during my years at USTR to serve in a couple of roles that have been diplomatic in character. I worked as a diplomat representing USTR in Brussels, and then more recently at the WTO in Geneva. I'm a believer in diplomacy, and I'm a very strong believer in the power of building personal relationships to be able to advance policy objectives. And if confirmed, I look forward to applying those skills to the task of rebuilding U.S. leadership. Thanks.
Thank you for that response. Mr. Chairman, do we have a few seconds for Ms. Pagan to briefly respond?
Sure.
Thanks. Ms. Pagan, just briefly, please.
Thank you. As Ambassador Tai recently said, the United States is committed to the WTO. If confirmed, it certainly would be an honor for me to represent the United States there. There are a lot of challenges like climate change and many other things that need to be collectively addressed, and I will do my best to represent the U.S. interests at the WTO.
All right. Thanks for those responses, and thanks for your willingness to serve. Good luck.
Thank you, Senator Carper. Senator Cassidy.
Mr. Begginstows, I am a gastroenterologist. You are a learned law school professor. It is with trepidation that I shall engage in this conversation. Okay? My colleagues and I worked for about 2.5 years to pass surprise billing legislation. And we finally got, on a bipartisan, bicameral basis last year, signed into law the No Surprises Act. And through this 2.5 years, we debated many approaches. It got all the stakeholders together, and we finally, and among these approaches were a straight benchmark payment, an independent dispute resolution process with the median in-network as the primary factor, and finally, a more open and robust independent dispute resolution framework, directing the arbiter to consider a variety of factors. That was ultimately what got the stakeholders, both parties, and both committees together. Okay, that's the prologue, if you will. And so now I apologize for the legalese, but you're going to immediately get this. And if I lose those who are not attorneys, I apologize, but this is important. This is how it's read. In determining which offer is the payment to be applied pursuant to this paragraph, the certified independent dispute resolution entity, with respect to the determination for a qualified IDR item or service, shall consider the qualifying payment amounts, or QPA, also known as the median in-network rate, and subject to subparagraph D, information on any circumstance described in clause Romanet 2, such information as requested in subparagraph B, Romanet 1, Roman numeral 2, and any additional information provided in subparagraph B, Romanet 2. What's in clause 2? I'll read some of it. The provider's training and experience, the patient acuity and complexity, the demonstration of good faith efforts or lack thereof to enter into a network contract. I could go on. Clearly, it's an and. You shall consider the median and network rate and this. Now, this is how the interim rule reads. And imagine the steam coming out of my ears. Accordingly, the certified IDR entity must begin with the presumption that the QPA, the qualified payment, is the appropriate out-of-network rate for the qualified independent resolution item or service under consideration. It goes on to say, the certified IDR entity must select the offer closest to the QPA, etc. Now, I'm a gastroenterologist, but when I read that, intuitively I understand that the statute states that the arbiter shall consider the qualified payment along with everything else, and this interim rule states the arbiter shall presume that the QPA is correct, leaving out the reference to the other items in the other paragraphs in direct opposition of the plain reading of the text. Do you think it's right that HHS has rewritten a law that it took 2.5 years for Congress to come to, balancing the needs of various stakeholders, and now it seems as if one stakeholder has gotten their wishes? Is that a correct thing for HHS to do?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. And I will say I hesitate because it is clear that you are perhaps a better lawyer than me, but certainly a better lawyer than I am a gastroenterologist. and what I would say a couple of things. I mean, the No Surprises Act is an incredibly important piece of legislation that was agreed to on, as you say, a bipartisan basis. I think that is very important. It is a compromise. Both the Department of HHS as well as the Department of Labor, Department of Treasury, OPM, have under that statute been required to act under a very aggressive timeline set by Congress to put out interim final rules to implement the statute by the deadline of January. One very important aspect of these interim final rules is they are interim final rules with a request for public comment.
Now, I'm told, though, that that's almost like this is going to be it. Yeah, you're going to get public comment, but this is a ship with inertia pushing it, and it's not going to be stopped by somebody saying, hey, wait a second, you're not going away the law actually reads. So I say that just to challenge because, again, if I thought it would make a difference, I would be less frustrated. And here it seems as if it's not going to make a difference. It's merely a show.
Well, Senator, I can assure you that should I be confirmed as general counsel, we will take extremely seriously the comments that are filed for these.
Can I ask, though, real quickly, since you'll be a counsel, is there a difference between shall consider and shall presume? Because the interim final rule says shall presume, and the way we wrote it was shall consider.
Yeah, Senator, so that is, I think, one of the very important kind of interpretive questions. The interim final rule does address that by saying that the other factors should be considered as well. But I understand your point, Senator, and I think.
But in all seriousness, yeah. I'm saying this not as a gotcha because I don't know. You're the professor. Yeah. Is there a difference between shall consider and shall presume?
So I think in the context of a presumption, you would necessarily consider other factors unless it is a conclusive presumption, which it's not in this rule. But I think the important point, Senator, that I would like to make to you is that I would commit that should I be confirmed to this position, we will definitely take a look at this as the comments come in and take very seriously the arguments that are made about whether this is consistent with the statute.
And therefore, since there seems to be an equivalency between the two phrases in your mind, could I just ask that you would change shall presume to shall consider?
So, as I say, Senator, I would very much commit to considering any of the comments that come in.
We're going to have to move on. I thank Senator Cassidy. The next two will be Senator Whitehouse and then Senator Langford.
Thanks very much, Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Let me start with Mrs. Pagan.
There are two issues we've been working on that involve the World Trade Organization. One is pirate fishing, and in particular the use of forced labor, in fact slavery, in pirate fishing. This matters a lot to American fisheries because it's really hard to compete with foreign fishermen who use slavery to their advantage. And the second is ocean plastics. We are headed for a world in which by 2050 there'll be more ocean plastic waste than there are living ocean fish if we don't get around this. Could you let me know where those two issues will fall in your priorities?
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. On forced labor and fisheries, as you probably know, the United States has made a proposal for the fish subsidies negotiations that we obviously continue to push and we hope will be part of the final outcome. So that is one way of trying to get at that issue, which is very important, and it is definitely tied to the issue of illegal fishing that we're trying to, and harmful subsidies that we're trying to curb through the agreement. So that is certainly a priority for us. On ocean plastics, I know this is another issue that is very important to you. I believe there's various, or at least one stream of work that's going on at the WTO on this issue and related issues. And so if confirmed, I will definitely work on this and continue to advance these issues at the WTO and hope to work with you and your office on this issue.
Thank you. This was a very strong bipartisan issue in the Senate. Senator Sullivan of Alaska did really terrific work as my main compadre on this. The previous president, Secretary of State, and trade representative actually all talked a good game on this issue, but once it got down into the weeds, we always collapsed and were outed in world press as being the country that was holding back progress on ocean plastics. So something needs to be fixed in the weeds where you will be, and I hope you will help fix it.
If confirmed, I commit to working with you on this issue.
Mr. Nyman, the Pandora Papers has shed new light on the role of kleptocracy and corruption. The president, I think, has correctly defined kleptocracy and corruption as national security hazards for America. How do you propose to prioritize anti-kleptocracy efforts in your proposed role?
Thank you for the question, Senator. It's, of course, a very important issue. Anti-corruption, is a real priority for the Biden administration. And in my role, one way in which I could make progress against this priority is via the international financial institutions. And so I would commit to work with the executive directors, for example, of the MDBs, to promote good governance reforms, anti-corruption efforts in the lending programs around issues like debt transparency, revenue administration, public contracting. There also, are instances and reasons that we would want to be vigilant about making sure there's no corruption within the international financial institutions, and I would also keep an eye toward those issues. And if
with a view that this is an American national security issue.
Absolutely. It's a matter of projecting our values to the world. I agree, Senator.
And stopping the subsidy and the aiding and abetting of our enemies.
I agree, Senator.
Mr. Frost, anti-money laundering requirements are really no more effective than money launderers' ability to get around them. Our banking institutions operate under robust anti-money laundering rules. But if you move over into private equity firms, hedge funds, venture capital firms, and other entities, the same rules don't apply. So it becomes super easy for somebody who wants to launder money to simply go through another gate. If we really want to fight money laundering, we actually have to make sure it doesn't get through various gates as opposed to just close one gate and leave other gates wide open. If you're confirmed, what do you intend to do about anti-money laundering requirements for private equity, hedge funds, and venture capital?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I'd like to maybe start by acknowledging your leadership in this area on anti-money laundering and more generally on shining a light on abuses of our financial system. For financial markets to work and perform well, they need to be transparent, and investors need to have confidence that they're not being manipulated. If confirmed, I'd be happy to work with you and your staff and with other offices at Treasury, including the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence, to ensure that AML obligations are being met and that there's a level and fair playing field.
Is there nothing that you could do by regulation?
That's something, if confirmed, I'd be happy to work with you and your staff and
Yeah, but the reason you'd be working with me and my staff is to do legislative stuff. You don't need to work with me and my staff to do regulatory stuff. You can do regulatory stuff. Is there not regulatory stuff that you could do?
Well, Senator, I would need to circle up with the relevant offices at Treasury who are a little bit more focused on these issues, but I'd be happy to engage with them.
Thank you. My time's up. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. We'll have Senator Langford, and then we'll have Senator Warren.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm slightly frustrated just the diversity of opinions here, Mr. Chairman. At some point, I'd like to be able to have more time because we have such a wide variety of different folks that are here. But thanks all for your service and for being here in the process. Let me run quickly through several questions on this. Mr. Wilson, let me first start with you in this. Trying to be able to deal with the role that you have in protecting intellectual property and its unique task on this. The Biden administration so far, one of the leading features they've had on intellectual property was trying to be able to give away intellectual property dealing with the TRIPS waiver. Obviously, Europe, multiple other entities have pushed back on that. Other countries are saying, yes, release intellectual property. We'll try to figure out how to be able to manufacture this. What would be your role in trying to be able to protect intellectual property of all American companies?
Thank you, Senator Langford. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I think the law that creates this position gives me a very clear direction that being a vigorous advocate for U.S. Intellectual property and innovation is the core of the function, and I take that to heart and would follow that guidance if confirmed. It's useful for me to have your perspective on the TRIPS waiver issue. As somebody inside the walls of USTR but not yet confirmed to this position, I've taken care to remove myself from active policy deliberations on that issue. But if I'm confirmed, obviously we'll prioritize getting up to speed on that issue on the state of play in Geneva, and happy to come back to you to.
There are quite a few other areas of a lot of research, and if we get into a point where we say, you know what, the whole world needs this, so let's just release this intellectual property, then we're going to have a cascading effects on other intellectual property. Finding ways to accelerate its usefulness and its accessibility is very different than just, that's a great invention you had, we're going to take it away from you. That doesn't encourage innovation in the days ahead. So we'll count on your leadership to protect that, both in China and what they actively do, but around the world as well. Mr. Nyman, let me ask you about this, about Afghanistan in particular. There's $9.5 billion that have been set aside and frozen out from the Taliban government at this point. Do you see a need to be able to unfreeze that $9.5 billion and release it to the Taliban?
Thank you for your question, Senator Langford. The situation in Afghanistan is of course, really terrible, and my heart goes out to the Afghan people. There's a real humanitarian crisis there, and we should do all that we can to try to help the Afghan people, for example, working with our partners in the UN and trying to get funding to people on the ground at this point without having that funding flow through the Taliban. Right now, my understanding is that the Treasury Department, the Fed is taking, the U.S. government is taking a strategic pause or a pause, not granting access to those reserves to the Taliban while the international community waits and sees how they respond to our concerns on treatment of women, treatment of girls, and I do find that appropriate at this time.
That would
Senator.
be entirely appropriate. Actually, would you favor special drawing rights in the International Monetary Fund if it actually gets to the Taliban?
I similarly, at this stage, think that the paused relationship between the IMF membership and the Taliban, so they don't currently have access to their SDR allocation at the IMF, is appropriate.
Thank you. I agree. Mr. Is it Begginstows? Pronounce it for me so I get it right.
Begginstows.
Thank you. I apologize for mispronouncing that. I don't ever intend to be able to do that for anyone on this.
Oh,
You're
no.
walking into a role as counsel with HHS, extremely important role for all of our counsels. There's no way you could know at this point unless someone had told you at this point. We've sent some letters to Secretary Becerra asking some very specific questions. In fact, we outlined 22 questions. He sent us a very nice letter back saying thanks for writing. But has not answered any of the 22 questions as we've gone through. Even some things that he stated in the actual nomination hearing when he came through here, things like, are you going to recuse yourself from cases that you were named in as a California AG, but now you're on the other side of it when he's literally suing the HHS. Now he's on the other side of it. So he said, nope, not going to do that. So we asked, just can you give us a list of the cases you're going to recuse yourself from? He hasn't even turned over that list of cases that he will recuse himself from, even though he said it during his testimony time sitting at that same table. So are you aware of that? Has that been brought to your attention at this point? Is there a need to be able to get that kind of list when he has filed so many suits against HHS that now he then is on the other side of it?
Thank you, Senator. I very much appreciate the question and take very seriously the responsibility to be responsive to Congress and this committee. And I can tell you, should I be confirmed to the position of General Counsel, one of the functions of the General Counsel's office is the ethics function at HHS, including monitoring appropriate recusals, and will certainly take seriously the ethics rules in that regard and responsiveness to this.
We will count on that, because one of the very first things that happened then from HHS was when they dropped a lawsuit that HHS had against the state of California. Was one of the early statements, but we've yet to be able to get any clarity whether the secretary was actually involved in dropping the case against his own state right after he got into office, to be able to clear that up, or to be able to deal with the University of Vermont Medical Center, who had a clear conscience protection issue that was placed against them, that then the administration came in and dropped immediately and said, no, we're not going to prosecute that out. And we also don't know for University of Pittsburgh. There have been some real questions there about how they've handled some of the abortion issues that they've dealt with, where they're literally harvesting and changing the procedures for an abortion, which is against federal law to be able to harvest those organs. The written statements we've seen seem to show they have, but we can't seem to get any information to be able to continue where there's a violation of federal law. Those are things that we're going to want to ask in the days ahead and be able to get clarity on.
All right. Thank you, Senator.
Thank my colleague, Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nearly 5 million people have died from COVID-19 worldwide, and although over 6 billion doses of the COVID-19 vaccine have now been administered globally, less than 1% of them have been administered in low-income countries. This inequity is disgraceful, and it also prolongs the pandemic's consequences here in the United States. The Biden administration has shown real global leadership in responding to the pandemic, but we must continue to use every tool available in the fight against COVID worldwide, and I'd like to discuss some of those tools today. Mr. Nyman, let me start with you. The first tool would fall under your purview. In August, the IMF approved an historic $650 billion in global financial assistance in the form of special drawing rights. These SDRs are a lifeline for developing countries as they continue to struggle with the fallout from the pandemic. Mr. Nyman, do you agree that SDRs are a critical tool for combating the COVID crisis, both globally and at home?
Thank you for the question, Senator. The increased SDR allocation to lower income countries represented a very meaningful increase in their reserves and therefore helped countries that otherwise might have been liquidity constrained in their vaccination efforts and their ongoing preparedness for public health investments that are much needed.
Good. So I take it that's a strong yes.
That's a strong yes.
Good. I appreciate it, and I agree. The $650 billion that the Biden administration helped secure is a good first step. But the IMF has made clear that the total need is somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.5 trillion. The House has authorized additional SDRs to meet this urgent need. It's time for the Senate to do the same. Of course, to respond to the COVID-19 crisis, we also need enough vaccines, PPE, tests, treatments for everyone. And this brings us to tool number 2. I was glad to see the Biden administration put people's lives over pharma profits by supporting a waiver of international intellectual property rules to help ramp up global vaccine production in a crisis. But almost 2 years into this pandemic, countries still haven't reached a deal to get it done. So Ms. Pagan and Mr. Wilson, if confirmed, you would both have key roles to play in securing this critical tool for global vaccine access. So let me just ask each of you, will you commit to making this a priority and using American leadership to secure a TRIPS waiver as soon as possible? Ms. Pagan?
Senator Warren, thank you for the question. As you know, we have been working in the WTO since Ambassador Tai's announcement that we support a waiver of intellectual property protections for vaccines.
I just want to hear a yes, that you're committed to this and you're going to make it a priority.
We have been working and we will continue to work on securing a successful outcome.
Good. Thank you. And Mr. Wilson, can I hear a yes from you?
Yes, you can. Ambassador Tai spoke to this issue of U.S. leadership in Geneva a week ago, 2 weeks ago. Her answer was yes, and so is mine.
Good. So I like these yeses backed up by I'm already working on it. Best kind. This is really important, and I appreciate your commitments here. So while the U.S. works with partners to approve a TRIPS waiver, we still have other tools to accelerate the COVID vaccine manufacturing and distribution without depending on international agreement, and that brings me to the third tool in the box. Mr. Begginstows, if confirmed, will you commit to conducting a thorough examination of all of the regulatory authorities at the department's disposal, including the DPA and any contractual rights in which HHS is entitled to dramatically expand global access to COVID vaccines, including through vaccine technology transfer?
Absolutely, Senator. As both the President and the Secretary have made clear, we need to do what we can to get out of this crisis, and that means considering all of the available legal tools, obviously running them through the appropriate processes to make sure we have the authority, but I think we have to leave no stone unturned in looking for those authorities.
Good. I very much like that approach. We've got to use all of the tools. We are in a crisis, and it puts everyone at risk around the world. It puts us at risk here at home. You know, this is a global emergency, and we must use all of our tools to fight this virus. The pandemic will not end anywhere until it ends everywhere. And now is the time for using all our tools. So thank you all. I look forward to your speedy confirmation and getting you even more tools to work with. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Daines.
Senator Crapo, thank you. I want to talk about intellectual property for a moment. Somebody who spent much of my career in global operations, spent 6 years actually living in China, working for an American corporation that was launching American brands to compete against Chinese brands there in China. I believe protecting U.S. intellectual property has to be a top priority for the U.S. trade rep. As you know, the United States and China signed the Phase 1 trade deal. It included major advancements in the protection of U.S. IP, but despite this agreement, China has not lived up to their end of the deal and has forced technology transfer and IP violations continue. I've sponsored this bipartisan bill. It's the Protecting IP Act, which recently passed the Senate as part of Senate Bill 1260 that would help boost enforcement in that Phase 1 China deal. In fact, I was over in China meeting face-to-face with Liu He back at the end of that whole negotiation process in Beijing. So I had a lot of hands-on personal experience and hence my passion on this issue. Mr. Wilson, if confirmed, what actions will you take to ensure that IP created in America is protected?
Thank you, Senator Daines. It's great to hear about your personal experience on these issues. And as you point out, the issue particularly of China's living up to the commitments that it made bilaterally to us in that earlier agreement is critical. Ambassador Tai spoke to this recently, and she herself is engaging directly with the Chinese. I would expect to do likewise if confirmed to make sure they're living up to those.
Thank you. I appreciate that, truly. Furthermore, would you support taking more aggressive actions against international IP abusers?
Senator, I think, again, if I'm confirmed, one of my first priorities would be to open up the toolbox that we have at USTR, evaluate the tools, consider where they can be used most effectively, and consult with the committee on how we do that.
Thank you. I'm going to talk for a moment about expanding market access for our ag producers. Ms. Pagan, a question for you. As you know, with 95% of the world's consumers outside the United States, ensuring that our farmers and ranchers in places like Montana and across the U.S. are able to compete on a level playing field is absolutely critical. If confirmed, would you commit to ensuring that expanding market access for Montana and U.S. ag in foreign markets would be a priority and on the agenda in any WTO ag negotiation?
Thank you for that question. Absolutely. Leveling the playing field and making sure that our farmers and ranchers have access to foreign markets is very important, and it will be a priority while I'm there.
And it really is the future in many ways for agriculture, with where you see, as I think old Wayne Gretzky said, he was successful because he skated where the puck was headed, not where it was at. When we think about where it's all going here, again, 95% of the world's consumers outside the United States. It continues to be a great opportunity for us, for our ag producers here in the United States. While multilateralism can play an important role in achieving global policy objectives, we need to make sure that all of our partners operate in a transparent manner. That is why I'm upset at findings that the current head of the IMF, Kristalina Georgiev, who was then head of the World Bank, pressured staffers to boost China's ranking in the World Bank's annual Doing Business report for 2018. Mr. Nyman, I know Senator Menendez brought this issue up earlier. Are you concerned by this scandal? And would you agree that this episode raises some fundamental questions about whether politics plays a role in other decisions being made by the IMF as well as the World Bank?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I agree with the Secretary that the Wilmer-Hale report raised serious and legitimate issues and concerns. And as an academic myself, I understand very viscerally the importance of confidence and trust in data, and confidence that analyses are conducted not with an eye toward generating any particular outcome. And so if confirmed, I would absolutely commit to taking strong action to boost and encourage the IMF, make sure that they renew their commitments to things like data transparency, safeguards, whistleblower protections at both international financial institutions.
What's your sense in looking at it so far? Do you think politics played a role?
Do I think politics played the role? I read the Wilmer-Hale report and think that the right way to approach their findings is to follow the recommendations that they made, such that whether politics mattered or not, we maintain the integrity and confidence in the international financial institutions. That seems to be the critical interest that, if confirmed, I would have in my role at Treasury in maintaining confidence in that international financial architecture.
Dr. Nyman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Crapo.
Thank you, Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To the nominees, congratulations. If appointed, look forward to working with all of you. I won't have time to ask all of you questions, so we'll submit most of those for the record. But there is one issue that really is pertinent on my mind right now, and Mr. Begginstows, you're going to be critical to addressing this. And I understand you're familiar with the case of Stanley Weber. For those that don't know, he's a former pediatrician with Indian Health Service who has been convicted of more than 13 felony counts relating to the sexual abuse of young boys. These assaults began in the early 1990s. They continued for more than 20 years. Dr. Weber practiced pediatrics through 2015 and did not leave the service until May of 2016. In the time since Weber was charged and arrested, there have been several investigations into his conduct and the systemic failures at IHS that enabled this behavior. I'd like to focus on one of those investigations, and it was commissioned by IHS and conducted by an independent contractor called Integritas. And that report was delivered to the IHS in January of 2020. But it was withheld from both members of Congress and the public in what the courts have since found to be a violation of the Freedom of Information Act. The report was made public just 2 weeks ago, and it details a pattern of failures by IHS management to act upon years of credible accusations of assault. Here are my concerns when it comes to the involvement of the Office of General Counsel. There's two of them. One is this. The Office of General Counsel made several critical missteps in the handling of the report by refusing to make its counselors available to Integritas for the investigation, and then by withholding the report itself from congressional oversight bodies and the public. That's one. Two, the report makes clear that in several instances, the HHS General Counsel failed to act in the best interests of IHS patients by making oversight recommendations to IHS managers that fell far short of the urgency and seriousness that this case required. So my question to you is, I want to know how you would handle a similar situation. Are there circumstances under which you would direct counselors not to cooperate with investigations commissioned by HHS agencies?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. And it is an absolutely tragic case that you're talking about. As you know, I am not at HHS and so have not had the benefit of being able to review the file of this case, but have certainly read the many news reports about this. And I can say, this is a case, and cases like this, should a case like this occur in the future, that really comes at the intersection of three of the most sensitive relationships and most important responsibilities that the department has to safeguard the health of the people who deal with HHS programs, the health and welfare of children, and the trust relationship that the United States government has with Indian tribes. To fail in all three of those responsibilities, I think, is just something that's unfathomable and beyond unfortunate. And to think that folks in the office to which I've been nominated to head and will lead if confirmed, actually failed to address it, it is not something that I would want to have happen should I be confirmed. So what does that mean? So one thing that I will want to do is, as soon as I get confirmed, should I be confirmed, is actually to review the decisions that were made in this context to make sure that there are always decisions that are made about investigative questions. Were these decisions made appropriately? And do we need to have new policies for the future, not just for IHS, but in general in dealing with these sorts of sensitive relationships? And Senator, I can commit to you that if I'm confirmed, I will take extremely seriously both the need to protect those in the charge of HHS and the need to be responsive to investigators who are duly appointed, as well as to this committee and to the Congress.
And do you have any problems referring alleged criminal activity to law enforcement for them to investigate?
So I think when, I've had to do this in many government jobs, when one comes across criminal conduct, there are procedures for referring that, and I think those procedures need to be followed.
Do you think it's appropriate to put together some sort of investigative committee that's made up of people that are supervised by the individual they're asked to investigate?
So I would want to look into the particular case here because, as I say, I don't really know much about the facts, but in general, that would be very much a red flag. We want people to be independent of those they're investigating.
Thank you. It is a serious matter, and that's why I've taken up most of my time here. Listen, I get the job that you're doing runs the intersection of administration, personnel, and criminal allegations. If that happens, then that has to be referred. And I understand the nexus between all three. We failed. IHS failed in this instance in all three of those. And that's on the general counsel's shoulders. And that's why your job is so important. And because these are the consequences if you fail. And so I'm looking for somebody that understands that and is willing to step up and do the right thing, particularly by the individuals and these young boys that suffered at the hands of this doctor for too long. And so thank you for your comments. And again, thank you all three for your willingness to serve.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Brown.
Thank you, Senator Crapo. Thanks to Chair Wyden and Ms. Pagan. Thank you for your help drafting the Brown-Wyden Rapid Response Mechanism in USMCA. You took another corporate trade agreement and turned it into an agreement that will actually help workers in all three countries. So thank you for that. I want to start by saying that China's entry into the WTO has been devastating for Ohio workers and Ohio companies. The Chinese government cheats the global system using forced technology transfers, intellectual property theft, chronic state-subsidized overcapacity in key industries like steel and solar to undermine U.S. industry. The WTO can't be a tool by which China bullies its competitors. If China continues to make a mockery of the World Trade Organization, Americans and the rest of the rule-following world are going to lose faith both in the WTO and their own leaders to appeal for it for relief. That's the lesson that's so important for us to understand. So, Ms. Pagan, detail for me how you think we should reform the WTO so it actually works to address Chinese abuses which harm American workers and businesses.
Thank you, Senator Brown. There's a number of ways. One important area is transparency. One of the areas where China fails is lack of transparency in its measures, and we want to improve transparency in terms of making sure that members are meeting their current obligations and bringing more transparency also to the WTO so we can have more conversations. The dispute settlement system has to be reformed because it has contributed to some of the difficulties for us to combat some of the unfair practices, and that's going to be a priority if I'm confirmed in my work forward at the WTO. I know this is an important issue and it's an important angle to bring to everything that we do at the WTO, is to bring the worker-centric focus, to remind ourselves of what, after all, we're there to do trade and to facilitate trade, but that it also means that you have to protect the workers that is where trade comes from. So there are any number of ways that we can address this issue, and if confirmed, I look forward to working with you on this.
Thanks, Ms. Pagan. The U.S., thanks to the Chair Wyden's efforts and his staff's efforts, has changed its approach to trade policy. The WTO must act similarly. I have confidence from our conversations, from talking to the ambassador about your work yesterday, that you will work toward that goal with the WTO and other member countries. So I know you've committed to that. I know you've committed to that over and over, and we count on that. Mr. Wilson, I appreciate our conversation the other day, how you plan to put workers at the center of our economic policy in terms of protecting intellectual property and innovation, especially in digital trade agreements. Thank you for your private commitment and your public commitment to do that. And last, Mr. Frost, I want to switch to your work with GSEs. I chair the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. Used to be the Wall Street Committee here. Now it's much more about housing. We have an affordable housing crisis. We know that. We'll need our entire housing system, including the GSEs, to work together to address it. We've heard from both consumer advocates and leaders about the importance of putting GSEs on a path to long-term stability so they can carry out their mission of providing all Americans with access to affordable housing. If you would commit to working with me on strengthening our housing system, expanding access to affordable housing.
Absolutely, Senator. I know this is an area that you feel passionate about. I do as well, and I know you've provided tremendous leadership here. The administration is deeply committed to affordable housing and has a number of efforts underway, as you know, to lower the cost of housing for American families. If confirmed, I'm committed to working with Congress to establish a housing finance system that works better than the system worked prior to the global financial crisis and the entrance into conservatorship. I think it's important that we have GSEs that work for the American people and don't have the too big to fail issues that we saw pre-financial crisis. If confirmed, would love to work with this committee and you and your staff on making a priority, making GSE reform a priority.
We count on that. Thank you, Mr. Frost. Thank you, Senator Crapo.
Thank you. Senator Barrasso.
Thank you very much, Senator Crapo. Mr. Nyman, China's the world's largest economy, has access to capital, sizable reserves to meet its own domestic development needs. Yet China continues to borrow billions of dollars from multilateral development banks. In 2016, China met the criteria for graduation from the World Bank. Since then, China has received $9 billion from the World Bank, $7.6 billion from the Asian Development Bank, and China obtains sizable loans. It's engaging in predatory lending, likely using that money to developing countries across the world. So China is now the world's largest official creditor, even though it continues to get all of this money from a lot that the United States has been putting into these organizations. The United States, I think, has a duty to make sure the U.S. taxpayer resources are going to countries that need it most, not China. A dollar lent to China is a dollar not available for a project to eliminate poverty in the developing world. The multilateral development banks need to focus on their development mission. So what's your strategy to end lending to China at multilateral development banks?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I do agree that our MDB efforts and development finance should be targeting the lowest income countries that need that assistance. And China has, as you said, by that standard graduated for years ago now. If confirmed, I would be committed to working with the executive directors and understand the best way forwards to achieve that outcome, which I agree with, Senator. I also, if confirmed, would be happy to discuss the efforts with you and your staff.
Great, yes. Thank you. Another question, Mr. Nyman. There are currently 840 million people across the globe with no electricity, none right now, today. People who live in poor and developing nations want and need a stable energy supply to grow their economy, to improve their lives. Energy is, I believe, a single critical tool to help countries alleviate poverty. The United States should be working to promote an all-of-the-above energy strategy. But the World Bank and many of the multilateral development banks are restricting lending for traditional energy projects. No modern economy can run on only renewable power, which we know is variable. A country needs continuous, abundant energy to run a manufacturing plant, a data center, or a hospital. I mean, I think of some of my travel to Africa, we're talking to hospital staff, and their biggest issue is lack of power when it comes to maternal death, but the death of the baby as well during delivery. So, I think these restrictions in the lending only exacerbates the global inequities of energy. In fact, all of Africa, with a population of 1.3 billion people, accounts for a little more than 3% of the total global electricity generation. If Africa tripled its electricity consumption based on only natural gas, it'd still be less than 1% of the annual global emissions footprint. So if you care about people in developing countries, and we all do, we'd help to turn the lights on. So if confirmed, will you commit to ensuring that multilateral development banks are promoting all forms of energy projects across the globe, including oil, gas, and coal?
Senator, the President and the Secretary have both described the climate change as an existential threat, and that's an assessment that I wholeheartedly agree with. I think the way to think of the cost in terms of energy and infrastructure that burns carbon, emits carbon, is not just the cost today, but also the cost to the future. And so I think it's appropriate and important for our efforts through the multilateral development banks on development financing per se to emphasize cleaner infrastructures that support our goals on climate change.
Well, I'll take that as a direct attack against these people who are desperately looking for energy to survive today, because that's a decision. This administration, I know it's not your position, but it's the administration's position, which, for the existence of those alive today in these communities, you take a look at the number one cause of death, environmental death, it's household indoor smoke for cooking. Period. No questions asked that's the concern, and I believe that it's an affront to these people and an insult for the administration to have such a position. So at the UN, President Biden announced he would once again double U.S. contributions to international climate change. In April, he pledged to increase contributions for global climate financing to $5.7 billion. So this means that since he just said he's going to double it, that's at $11.4 billion a year. This is happening at a time American people are facing significant challenges at home. Communities across the nation are just emerging from a deadly pandemic. We're dealing with stifled economies, soaring debt, declining infrastructure. Front page story of the New York Times today, people under inflation are looking at the largest increase in prices and costs for Thanksgiving dinner. This is the New York Times front page today. But whether it's the Green New Deal, the UN Green Climate Change Slush Fund, the American people cannot afford these disastrous policies. So please explain why American taxpayers should support borrowing more from countries like China in order to send it overseas to international bureaucrats in the name of climate change. And I hope to hear more about that. It's an existential threat.
Senator, this isn't an easy situation. It's, of course, I just want to acknowledge, of course, it's a difficult issue, but we have trade-offs that we have to consider, and I agree with the assessment that time is running out. It is really important that we do all that we can to decarbonize the planet, and I think as such, it is appropriate to emphasize sustainable infrastructure projects through our development financing policies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired.
Thank you very much, Senator Barrasso. At this point, Senator Portman, who is on the web, is next, but we're not sure that he's back from his vote. Senator Portman, are you there? Is there any senator who is on the web who is here who's ready to ask questions? Well, if not, while we're waiting for the chairman to return from voting, I've got a couple of questions that I might just jump into. And first is for you, Ms. Pagan, and also for Chris Wilson. And that is with regard to the TRIPS waiver. Ambassador Tai committed at the trade agenda hearing to brief this committee on negotiations to waive the U.S. rights under the WTO agreement on trade-related intellectual property rights, or TRIPS. This hasn't happened. The briefing has not happened. Members on both sides of the aisle are concerned about this issue, particularly about allowing China and Russia to use our intellectual property for vaccines with impunity. My question for both of you is the same. Would you commit to opposing a waiver or peace clause for the TRIPS agreement that extends to Russia and China? Ms. Pagan?
Thank you. I know this is a very important issue. I would just say that the conversations in Geneva are ongoing and they're sort of stuck. So there's, we're trying to be constructive over there. I will say that on the issue of China and Russia or other people that shouldn't be getting access to our innovation, we will be very clear-eyed on whatever the outcome is to ensure that that doesn't happen. The devil is always in the details, and with respect to consulting with you and the committees, I believe we will do that.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Crapo. As my colleague has said, there are lots of ins and outs of this discussion in Geneva that still need to take place. It's very helpful for me to understand your particular concern about technology being shared with two WTO members in particular. I think it's incumbent on us as we continue to be involved in the discussions to ensure that we're managing the risks as effectively as we can.
Well, thank you. And neither of you were willing to commit to oppose a waiver of TRIPS for Russia and China. I understand that you're working with the administration that's already said that it is considering doing that. So I would just say I would encourage you to take back advocacy of protecting Americans and American industry and technology rather than yielding that technology, the access to that technology to Russia and China, where the case has not been made that there is an emergency that somehow justifies this. Next, another question for you, Mr. Wilson, on intellectual property. And actually, I think you answered this earlier, but I had to step out or I got my attention pulled away. But if confirmed, you'll be responsible for helping to lead the new administration's policy on trade-related intellectual property rights, and your leadership will be very important for the effort to address acts, policies, and practices of foreign governments that have a significant adverse impact on the value of U.S. innovation. It'll also be important in helping to ensure that private intellectual property rights are enforced and maintained in the face of increased calls to socialize private property and information. How will you approach solving the increasingly thorny intellectual property disputes, particularly disputes in spaces like digital and pharmaceutical industries?
Thank you, Senator. As a nominee for this position, I take very seriously the responsibility that I would have to essentially build and create this new position, to develop the appropriate priorities, both for myself in the position and for the future. I think you've pointed correctly to the complex intersections between intellectual property policy and emerging technologies, especially in the digital space. I understand that those are going to pose particular challenges. It'll be very important to me as I work with my colleagues at USTR to build the position to stay in close touch with you, your staff, other members of the committee, to make sure that we're meeting your expectations.
Thank you. And Mr. Begginstows, a question for you on advisory opinions. The HHS Office of General Counsel has the ability to issue advisory opinions, which, although they lack the force of law, can direct policymaking efforts very powerfully. Where members of Congress and the administration disagree on policy choices, the administration's rationale can be important for Congress to understand as to why the administration has decided to move in a particular way. If confirmed, will you be willing to make your advisory opinions available to Congress after request?
Thank you, Senator. I know this is a very important matter, and I will say I take very seriously Congress's responsibility to exercise oversight. The legislative branch of government passes the laws under which the departments operate and appropriates the money that the departments spend, and so obviously has a very significant oversight responsibility. And part of that responsibility, I think, imposes a correlative responsibility on the executive branch to let Congress know what the executive branch is doing and why the executive branch thinks they have the authority to do it. And if I am confirmed to this position, I can commit to you that we will engage in that conversation. And if there is a question about what HHS is doing and why we think we have the authority to do it, should I be confirmed, that will be communicated to you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, we think we may have one more member almost here, and I've got one more question, so I'm going to go ahead with that. And this one is for you, Mr. Nyman. I'm deeply concerned by the reporting that senior officials at the World Bank manipulated data to improve China's ranking in its Doing Business report at the behest of Chinese officials, at a time when the World Bank was deep into negotiations with countries, including China, for a share capital increase. I'm even more concerned that since this story was reported, one of those officials has been promoted to the leadership of the IMF, and even more egregiously, that since the story was confirmed in an investigation by an independent law firm, the IMF retained that official as its leader. If confirmed, what will you do to ensure that foreign powers do not undermine or manipulate the international institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the OECD that are tasked with promoting economic growth and financial stability?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. If confirmed, one very important part of my role would be to ensure that global confidence remained and we preserved the integrity of the international financial institutions. We've worked very hard to build them up and make them a particularly important tool in the international financial landscape, and we would need to work hard to continue safeguarding them. And I agree that the reports could reduce confidence if we don't take strong action to boost things like accountability, protect the data integrity. The Wilmer-Hale report that you're referring to included a number of recommendations, and for example, together with the executive directors, I would review those recommendations and strongly consider adding things like the possibility, considering possibilities like potentially making the analyses more broadly available, doing things to protect the actual analysis from any sort of involvement of people outside of the team on the political side of the institutions.
Well, thank you. And in light of the facts of this situation, do you still think it appropriate that the administration seek an increase in SDRs for the IMF?
I am not aware. I do not believe that Treasury is currently considering any additional SDR allocation.
All right, thank you. I'm glad to hear that, and I'd just like to let you know that I don't believe the United States should support the allocation of any additional SDRs to the IMF while the official at issue here remains the managing director. And so I just give you that bit of opinion of my own as we approach these kinds of issues. With that, is Senator Thune with us? Okay, if Senator Thune's not available, then that means that you are all done with your questions, with the interrogation. And I'd like to thank each of you for being willing to take upon yourself these commitments to serve our country, and for being here today, and for your responses, even though I didn't agree with all of them. You will get additional questions in writing. Regarding the questions for the record, the deadline for members to submit the QFRs will be next Tuesday, November 2nd at 5 p.m. And for our members, that 5 p.m. deadline is firm. Do we have a time frame for responses? Okay, we don't have a specific time frame for responses, but it's quickly, please. We appreciate prompt responses. We do thank you all for your cooperation and your attendance here. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.